July 2026. Italy, the Tiber Valley. 20 kilometers from modern Rome. Dust, heat, and an excavation that was supposed to be routine archaeological business. Another season, another grant, another line in a report. A team of Italian and American archaeologists is digging what's called the zero layer, the very bottom, where by every canon there should be nothing but bare continental clay, untouched by human hands. Because everything above that layer is already the classics: potsherds, remains of wattle and daub walls, traces of Iron Age hearths, and what lies below that by definition, nothing. The floor, the 0 point beyond which history simply doesn't exist. But that day, at a depth where by every measure there should have been nothing but blind earth, the excavator bucket snagged on something wrong. Not a rock. A rock sounds different, duller, flatter. This clinked as though someone, 3,000 years down, had left behind a piece of the future. Work stops. A crew arrives with brushes and scalpels instead of shovels, and into the light, millimeter by millimeter, grain by grain of soil, something begins to emerge that simply has no business being in this layer of earth. A flat disc, the size of a soup plate, matte black, its surface textured in an almost honeycomb pattern as if someone had woven carbon fiber into a design humanity. At that point in time, simply didn't know. The material has survived perfectly, as though 3,000 years were not a span of time for it, but a single instant. No corrosion, no cracks, no trace of oxidation, the kind you'd expect even from noble metals, let alone from organic matter or a primitive composite. The dig director, a professor from La Sapienza, drops to his knees in the trench and looks at the way people look when they understand. What they're holding doesn't fit into any category they know. Not Etruscan, not Latin, not Mycenaean, nothing else either. This doesn't resemble a Bronze Age artifact at all. A few hours later, when the object is carefully extracted and moved to the field lab, an engraving appears under ultraviolet light on the underside of the disc. Microscopic, almost invisible to the naked eye, a code made of letters and numbers, rendered in a crisp, technical, mercilessly modern typeface. SIQSD01, prototype, not for public release. Stark Industries. Within a 3,000-year radius of this point, there should be no Starks, no Industries, no Latin script in this form, not even the concept of a serial code. And yet here it is, resting on a stainless steel tray inside a canvas tent on the bank of the Tiber, stubbornly refusing to fit into the timeline of human civilization. How could a fragment of technology that won't be invented for another 30-plus centuries end up buried in Italian soil in an age when Rome itself didn't yet exist here? Only scattered Latin settlements, legends, and shepherds' campfires along the river. To answer that question, we'll have to go back 3,000 years, to a coastline where an entire civilization is burning down, to the point where two heroes of the Trojan War received two completely different gifts from the very same man from the future, and one of those gifts was fair, while the other, by every law of the genre, sounds like a cruel joke. The 9th year of the siege of Troy, a city that, by any conception of the ancient world, should have fallen in the very first year of the war, still stands. The walls of Troy are not merely stone. They are the wounded pride of an entire Greek coalition that expected a swift punitive campaign and got a decade-long meat grinder by the sea instead, one that claims another batch of Hellas's finest warriors every season, on both sides of the front. And into this thick, stagnant war, soured like old wine, someone has just dropped a cheat code. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a man whose head always worked faster than his hand, reached for a sword, stands on the shore, holding a flat tablet. Matte glass, warm to the touch, almost alive. It was just handed to him by a tall, self-assured man, indecently calm for a war zone, dressed in a suit that has absolutely no business being here, Tony Stark. The tablet activates without a single touch. A voice, sounding simultaneously from nowhere and everywhere, polite, faintly ironic, with the flawless diction of a being clearly not explaining elementary things to mortals for the first time. "Good day, sir. My name is Jarvis. Judging by the position of the stars and the distinctive smell of burning cedar, salt marshes, and unwashed bronze armor, the year is approximately 1184 BCE. Wonderful. How may I be of assistance? Odysseus, who in his lifetime has seen cyclopes, sirens, and gods descending from Olympus on their petty errands, allows himself for the first time in 9 years of war a genuine, almost childlike smile. This had happened a few hours earlier, that same day, on a deserted stretch of beach half a kilometer from the Greek camp, where the roar of the surf drowns out any voice. The air split apart with a dry crack, and 5 paces from Odysseus, a massive fiery ring flared up, spinning wildly, hurling sheaves of sparks and scorching a perfectly round circle of melted glass into the sand. Out of the portal, hands stuffed casually into his pockets, stepped a man in a light, futuristic jacket, with a well-groomed beard and the smirk of someone clearly used to surprising gods, kings, and every rank in between. He gave Odysseus a quick, appraising glance, lingered on the bronze blade in his hand, and gave a small shake of his head with that particular blend of condescension and warmth that only a man with 3,000 years of technological progress at his back can afford. From this moment on, the war changes. Jarvis isn't just an advisor. He is a strategic intelligence, capable, in real time, of calculating the logistics of the enemy camp, reconstructing the layout of Trojan positions from scraps of intelligence, working out the psychological weaknesses of individual commanders from the way they arrange their phalanxes, and offering Odysseus tactics 9 years ahead of anything the Bronze Age knows about war. While the Trojan priests read the entrails of sheep, the man of Ithaca gets a 3-day weather forecast, a wind rose for precisely calculating flaming arrows, and a probability model of exactly which section of the wall a given siege engine will strike. This is unfair. So unfair that Odysseus himself, a cynic, a schemer, a man who has played dirty his whole life and taken pride in it, freezes for a second with that thought somewhere at the bottom of his mind. But war is war, and victory has been promised to the Greeks by fate itself. So the pangs of conscience quickly drown in the roar of the next assault. But this story, and this is the whole reason we're telling it, has a second half. Because that same night, while Odysseus on the beach was getting acquainted with the artificial mind that would turn the tide of the war, the air split apart with that exact same crack. Only this time, not on an empty beach, but inside Troy itself, in the courtyard of one of the noble houses near the eastern gate, where the city, exhausted after 9 years of siege, lay sleeping. The portal flared up quieter than it had on the shore, as if the technology itself knew that here, behind enemy walls, noise could cost someone their life, and out of it, with that same relaxed stride, hands in his pockets, stepped Tony Stark. He wasn't here by accident, and he wasn't looking for Priam. Not for Hector either, the city's chief shield, who already carries burden enough. He was looking for a man in a supporting role, a man whose name history would preserve not as the name of Troy's defender, but as the name of its continuation, Aeneas, son-in-law of the Trojan royal house, a warrior, son of Aphrodite herself through his mother's line, and a man burdened with the kind of responsibility heavier than any armor. He has an old, frail father, a small son, a wife, a family that will need to be pulled from the rubble when, not if, this city falls. Aeneas, woken by the crack of collapsing air, burst into the courtyard sword first and froze at the sight of a man by the well, dressed in clothes that belonged to no mortal kingdom. Stark raised his open palms peaceably, almost lazily, and the first thing he did was shake his head at the sword, the exact same way he had shaken it at the sight of Odysseus's blade on the beach hours earlier. "Relax, soldier. I'm not here for you, not in the way you're thinking," he said, with the same self-assured smirk he'd greeted the man of Ithaca with. "Let me guess, son of Aphrodite, son-in-law of the king, always playing second fiddle, even though you're basically carrying half this city on your back. Yeah, I did my homework. I've got a good assistant." He sat down on the edge of the well, the way a man sits when he has nothing to lose and nowhere to rush to. and pulled from under his jacket the object that would define the rest of Aeneas's life. A flat, matte black disc, shaped almost like a shield. At its center, a single indicator, glowing faintly blue, like an ember that refuses either to flare up or to die out. "Listen closely, kid, because I'm not going to repeat myself," Stark said, and his voice, usually so ironic, was for once almost entirely free of its usual sarcasm. "Here's the news, good and bad, all in one, just how I like it. Bad news. Your city is a fixed point in time. It's going to burn. I've run the numbers every which way. And trust me, if there'd been a single option to fix it, I'd already be knee-deep in blueprints. Good news. Out of these ashes, you're going to build an empire. Not metaphorically, literally. Your descendants are going to mean more to this world than the entire Greek coalition combined. Kings, swagger, and all." Aeneas looks at the disc in Stark's hands and understands none of it, nor should he. Not a word of what's been said means anything within the categories of his world. When the fire reaches your hearth, and it will, mark my words, you stand on this plate. You, your wife, your son, your father, all four, at once. It does its job exactly once, and there's no second chance, not under any circumstances. Stark places the sphere in Aeneas's hands and holds his palms a second longer than necessary just to pass the object over, because what comes next is the hardest part to get across. And here's the golden rule. Drive it into your skull harder than any oath to the gods. 4 people. Exactly. Not one more. So much as 100 extra grams of gold on top, and the system goes haywire instead of a rescue. You get a fireworks show that saves no one. No treasures, no trophies, no extra baggage. Only the lives you're not willing to lose. Overload it, and you turn to ash right along with your city. He stands, brushes non-existent dust off his knees, and tosses out one last line, half mockery and half completely genuine bitterness. Funny, isn't it? I gave one guy a god of war in his pocket. I'm giving you the rescue of 4 people. But you'll see in the end, your gift's going to turn out to be worth a whole lot more. And he vanishes into the dark just as silently as he appeared, leaving Aeneas alone with an object whose weight in the most literal, physical sense of the word will become the most agonizing question of the coming months of war. There it is, the unfair balance at the heart of this entire story. One hero gets an all-knowing artificial intelligence that turns him into the perfect commander. The other gets a single attempt and a survival math problem, where the price of a mistake isn't defeat, but the complete and irreversible destruction of everyone he loves. Odysseus gets to play God of War. Aeneas gets Russian roulette with a calculator instead of a revolver. And the next 9 months of the siege will show. Sometimes the most terrifying enemy isn't the army beyond the wall, but your own scales, on which you must weigh the unweighable life against life, memory against the future, gold against the air your children will breathe. The morning after the nighttime visit from the future found Troy just as it had always been, majestic, made of stone, unshakable to the eye. But it was on this very morning that a crack began creeping into the steady rhythm of the 9-year siege, one the Trojans didn't yet suspect existed, and one the Greeks were only just beginning to grasp the scale of. Odysseus rose before dawn and, while the camp still slept, walked the perimeter of the fortifications, accompanied by a glowing tablet hidden beneath the fold of his cloak. In a single night, Jarvis had managed to compile a detailed map of the Trojan defenses, not an approximate one sketched from scouts' rumors, but an engineering-grade one, marking firing angles from the walls, blind spots between the towers, and the schedule of Trojan guard rotations, which the artificial intelligence had calculated from barely perceptible changes in torchlight on the walls over several nights of observation. That same autumn, the Greek camp began changing from within, and Hector felt it first, Priam's eldest son, Troy's supreme commander, and the one man on either side of the front line whose name was spoken with equal respect by Trojans and Greeks alike. His tactics, honed over 9 years of war, suddenly began failing in places where they had never failed before. Ambushes that had always worked flawlessly now ran straight into Greek units that seemed to already know the route. Night raids by Trojan scouts came back empty-handed. Either the enemy seemed to anticipate their arrival, or shifted position an hour before the attack. Hector was not a superstitious man. He didn't look for the wrath of the gods in these failures, nor did he suspect sorcery. His military mind searched for a rational explanation, and none could be found which troubled him more than any mystical interpretation would have. He doubled the vigilance of the guards, changed the signal system between the towers, tightened discipline among the defenders, and still the advantage kept slipping through his fingers. Slowly but inexorably, like sand through a clenched fist. The source of that advantage sat, in those days, inside Odysseus's tent, working methodically, tirelessly, with no room for error. Jarvis analyzed every movement of Trojan units, every detail of the terrain around the city, the pattern of the winds, the phases of the moon affecting the visibility of night raids, and even the manner in which Trojan commanders arranged their formations. And from this data, the artificial mind predicted their behavior in the next battle with terrifying accuracy. Odysseus no longer guessed. He planned, while a new, ruthlessly rational war was being born in the Greek camp. A story of an entirely different order was unfolding within Troy itself. A story of pride, rage, and personal enmity that would, in the end, determine the city's fate far more than any strategic calculation. At the center of this story stood Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek coalition, a man whose fame had thundered across both shores of the Aegean long before the siege began. His relationship with the Greek high command had long been strained, and with the arrival in camp of a captive woman named Briseis, seized from one of the coastal Trojan cities, the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon boiled over into open hostility. Insulted by the seizure of a prize he considered rightfully his as a warrior, Achilles refused to take the field, withdrew his Myrmidons away from the main camp, and sank into a demonstrative, heavy silence, watching the war from a distance. That silence turned out to be far more dangerous for the Greeks than it first appeared, because it was precisely what freed Hector's hands for one of the boldest raids of the entire siege. Taking advantage of Achilles' absence from the battlefield, the Trojans launched a massed assault on the Greek ships, drawn up on the sand of the shore, aiming to set the fleet ablaze and strip the besieging army of its only route of retreat. The attack very nearly succeeded. Trojan warriors broke through almost to the water's edge, and only the desperate resistance of Greek units, thrown into battle unprepared, kept the flames from consuming the ships entirely. It was at this critical moment that Patroclus stepped onto the battlefield, Achilles' closest friend, a man whose fate would become inseparably entwined with the tragedy that follows. Patroclus, unable to bear the sight of Greeks dying beside the burning ships, persuaded Achilles to lend him his armor and let him lead the Myrmidons into battle not for personal glory, but so that the mere sight of him in that recognizable armor would strike fear into the Trojans and force them to fall back from the ships. The ruse worked. Trojan warriors, spotting from a distance the figure in Achilles' armor, faltered and began to retreat, believing the greatest of the Greek warriors had finally returned to the fight. Patroclus, caught up in the thrill of his first real battle, drove the retreating Trojans much farther than he had originally planned, pursuing them almost to the very walls of the city against Achilles' direct instruction not to get carried away with the chase and to turn back as soon as the threat to the ships had been lifted. That fatal mistake cost Patroclus his life. Right at the walls of Troy, his path was blocked by Hector, who, realizing in the heat of the fight that this was not Achilles himself but someone else wearing his armor, did not retreat but stood and fought. The duel ended in Patroclus' death, and with him died an entire era of this war, because the grief and fury of Achilles, upon learning of his closest friend's death, proved to be a force capable of altering the course of the entire siege more than any strategic calculation ever could. Returning to the war with the fury of a man who had lost the only person close to him on this earth, Achilles forewent the long weeks of mourning and took the field the very same day he learned of Patroclus' death. The Greeks greeted his return with something close to superstitious relief, as though fate itself had returned to the camp. finally tipping in their favor. Hector, learning that Achilles had returned to the war for vengeance directed specifically at him, faced a choice that would clench the heart of any Trojan commander. His father, Priam, and all his closest advisors begged him to take shelter behind the city walls and not go out onto the plain, knowing the inhuman fury now driving Achilles. But Hector, for whom honor and responsibility to the city weighed no less than life itself, went out beyond the walls alone to meet face-to-face an opponent the entire camp considered unbeatable. The duel between Hector and Achilles at the walls of Troy became one of the most terrible and, at the same time, one of the most honest scenes of the entire war. Not a battle of armies, but a personal duel between two warriors, each fighting not for territory or spoils, but for what had become dearer to him than his own life. Hector fought for the city, for his father, for the wife and small son, watching for the outcome from the walls. Achilles fought for the memory of a friend who no longer lived. The duel ended in Hector's death, and with that death, Troy lost not merely its finest warrior, but its very backbone, the figure around whom the entire defense of the city had held together for 9 years. Achilles' fury did not subside even after his opponent's death. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and, in full view of the entire city watching in mute horror from the walls, dragged it around the Trojan fortifications, an act that, in the eyes of both Greeks and Trojans, went far beyond any cruelty permissible in war, insulting not only the fallen warrior, but the very idea of martial honor. This war was supposedly being fought over. Only a few days later, when the fury began giving way to more complex and human feelings, did old Priam, king of Troy, resolve on an act that would go down in history as one of the most poignant expressions of a father's grief and dignity in all of ancient tradition. Under cover of night, without an escort, the king personally traveled to the Greek camp to kneel before the man who had killed his son and beg the right to take Hector's body for a proper burial. Achilles, against the expectations of the entire camp, granted the request not out of calculation or weakness, but because in the eyes of the old man who had lost a son, he glimpsed for a moment a reflection of his own father, who would one day have to mourn him in exactly the same way. Hector's body returned to the city, and Troy sank into a mourning it had never known in all 9 years of the siege. But while the city's walls echoed with grief for its fallen hero, in the shadow of this tragedy, an entirely different story continued to unfold, quiet, almost unnoticed against the backdrop of such enormous grief, but no less fateful for the future of a single family. Aeneas, the royal house's son-in-law, was in those days burying not only a comrade in arms, which Hector had been to him, but also the last illusion that the city could hold out on its own strength. He watched, year after year, as the defense crumbled in ways that couldn't be explained by enemy luck or by Trojan commanders' mistakes. He didn't know the nature of the invisible advantage the Greeks had gained that autumn, but every fiber of the warrior in him sensed that something fundamental had changed in this war, and that the change was working against Troy irreversibly. It was in these very weeks that the disc left with him by the man from another time first began to feel not like a mysterious gift, but like a burden in the most direct, physical sense of the word. Aeneas carried it with him constantly, hidden beneath his cloak, tied to his belt with a strap of his own making, and in the brief lulls between battles he caught himself running his fingers again and again over the smooth, flawlessly even surface of the matte black material, as if searching within it for an answer to a question that gave him no peace, day or night. Just 4 people. He repeated that number to himself so often it began appearing in his dreams at night along with images of what he would have to leave behind if that moment truly came. His countrymen, his grandfather's weapons, his wife's gold jewelry, the scrolls bearing the genealogy the Trojan nobility had kept for generations. Everything that made life not mere survival, but the continuation of a lineage filled with meaning and memory. Every evening, returning home after another day that brought the city closer to its inevitable end, Aeneas would approach the chest where the family valuables were kept and stand over it for long stretches, weighing in his mind, quite literally weighing what he was prepared to carry with him and what he would have to give up forever the moment the fire finally reached his doorstep. It was a quiet war, invisible to anyone else, fought within his own walls, a war between attachment to the past and responsibility for the future. One that, for Aeneas in those weeks, was no less exhausting than the battles at the city walls. His father, old Anchises, who by now almost never left his chambers due to a frailty that grew more obvious with every month of the siege, had no idea of the weight of the choice that had settled on his son's shoulders. Neither did little Aeneas, too young to understand anything beyond fear at the sound of a night alarm. Nor did Aeneas's wife, Creusa, know of it, though she, as a woman who felt the shifts within her own household more keenly than any military report, noticed more and more often the heavy, distant look with which her husband had lately been gazing at the family chests, as though he saw in them not treasures, but an invisible burden he would one day have to set down. And so, while one hero of this war received in his hands a perfect, all-knowing instrument of victory, one that turned every battle into an already decided outcome, another hero was slowly and painfully learning an art described in no military treatise of that age, the art of letting go. And by the time the walls of Troy shook for the last time, that skill would prove far more important for the fate of his line than all the strategic superiority granted by artificial intelligence to the other side. Hector's death did not end the war, it merely stripped away Troy's last layer of illusion. As long as Priam's eldest son stood at the head of its defense, the city could tell itself the walls would hold for one more winter, one more season, one more year, just as they had held for 9 years running. After his death, that illusion crumbled, replaced by something far more sober and far more frightening, a sense not of salvation, but of postponement. Priam, having mourned his son with the full weight of a father's grief, nonetheless remained king, and his royal duties would not allow him to dissolve entirely into mourning. The defense of the city fell to the remaining commanders, less experienced, less respected, forced to learn what Hector had known by instinct. And on the other side of the walls, the Greek camp, emboldened by the death of Troy's chief shield, intensified its pressure with a methodical precision that now rested not only on Achilles' fury, but on Jarvis's cold calculations. It was in these very weeks that the advantage granted to Odysseus by the man from the future revealed itself in full. Assaults that had once cost the Greeks enormous losses were now planned with surgical precision, choosing the hours of lowest vigilance among the Trojan guards, directions offering the narrowest angle of fire from the walls, moments when the wind carried the smoke of the signal fires away from the watchposts. The Trojan defense, which only yesterday had seemed unbreakable, began cracking along several fronts at once because for the first time in 9 years of war, the enemy knew exactly where and when to strike. Aeneas, whose combat experience and closeness to the fallen Hector had made him one of the key figures of the defense in these weeks, felt what was happening more keenly than most. He had no knowledge of the artificial mind working inside Odysseus's tent, but every battle gave him more and more indirect confirmation that this war had stopped being a war in the familiar sense. The enemy no longer erred, no longer hesitated, gave none of the natural mistakes that any defense mounted against mortal commanders relies upon. Meanwhile, the burden Aeneas had carried beneath his cloak since that night by the well continued to weigh on him, not physically, since 4 people was the limit of the transportable mass, not the weight of the disc itself, which remained light, almost as if it were empty, but morally, more heavily, with each passing day. Every evening he returned to the house where his family's treasures were kept, accumulated over several generations of Trojan nobility, and ran the same agonizing arithmetic through his mind again and again. Father, wife, son, 3 lives that had to fit within the allotted limit alongside his own, and after that calculation, there was no room left for a single extra thing, no matter how much it meant to the memory of his line. Here it's worth pausing to ask the question Aeneas himself, most likely, asked himself in those weeks, tossing and turning through sleepless nights. Imagine, for a moment, that the weight of this decision had fallen to you. Behind you, a chest of gold accumulated over generations of ancestors, relics binding you to the history of your line more tightly than any oath. Ahead of you, a mechanism that will work exactly once, where any miscalculation of weight costs you not the loss of treasure, but the loss of everyone you love. What would you choose to risk taking even a fragment of that legacy with you, trusting the margin would hold? Or to give up everything down to the last coin, leaving no chance whatsoever for catastrophe? Anyone who takes this question seriously, rather than as an abstract riddle, quickly realizes the choice here isn't between greed and generosity, but between the illusion of control and genuine humility before a limit that cannot be cheated. Aeneas, with no one to consult who understood the nature of the device, arrived again and again at the same conclusion, though each time it cost him as much as if he were reaching it for the first time. Gold can be earned again. The memory of one's ancestors can be carried forward without physical proof in language, in names, in the stories he would one day pass on to his son. But the lives that fit on this plate cannot be replaced by any wealth in the world. And yet he never allowed himself to make the final decision in advance, knowing the true cost of the choice would only become clear in the moment he had to act, not merely reflect. While this quiet drama, invisible to anyone outside, unfolded inside Aeneas's house, the war outside moved toward its inevitable conclusion through one more tragic turn, one without which the story of the siege of Troy would be incomplete. Achilles, whose fury after Patroclus's death had for a time made him nearly invincible on the battlefield, remained vulnerable in that one single weakness known only within a narrow circle of those closest to him, a weakness in his heel, the one place on his body left unprotected by the blessing he received at birth. Only a very small circle of the initiated knew of this vulnerability, and it was precisely this knowledge, reaching the Trojan camp by roundabout means, that determined the outcome of one of the most significant scenes of the entire war. Paris, Priam's youngest son, whose flight with Helen from Sparta had served as the formal pretext for this entire decade-long slaughter, possessed neither the martial skill of his fallen brother nor his courage in open combat. And yet it was to him that fell the role that, in the eyes of later generations, would remain one of the most contested in the entire Trojan cycle. During one of the battles at the city walls, guided as the legend has it by Apollo himself, Paris loosed an arrow that found the single, unprotected point on the body of the greatest warrior of the Greek coalition. Achilles did not fall to the sword of an equal opponent, but to a single arrow, loosed in a moment when all his inhuman might proved powerless against one simple law of physics. Even the most perfect armor is vulnerable exactly where it doesn't exist. Achilles' death shook the Greek camp more than any other loss of the entire siege. But, against Trojan expectations, it did not break the coalition's fighting spirit, and it certainly did not halt the invisible mechanism now driving Greek strategy, regardless of who led the charge. Odysseus, whose role in command only grew after Achilles' death, kept receiving from Jarvis the same precise, merciless calculations, and the death of the coalition's greatest warrior became not a defeat of the Greek war machine, but merely a pause before a new, far more elaborate plan, one that would go down in history as the greatest ruse of war the ancient world had ever seen. It was in these very weeks, watching heroes fall on both sides of the front, not only strangers, but Trojan warriors close to him, that Aeneas finally grasped what had, until then, remained more a vague foreboding than a clear thought. This war would not end in compromise. It would not end from either side's exhaustion, as so many wars before it had. It would end in the complete and irreversible destruction of one side, and with every fallen hero, with every new and improbable stroke of Greek fortune, it became more and more obvious which side was doomed. From this point on, Aeneas stopped asking himself whether the moment would come when he would have to stand on the matte black plate together with his family. The question shifted to something far more practical and far more frightening. How much time did he have left to prepare for that moment, so as not to make a mistake whose cost could never be undone? After Achilles' death, the Greek camp existed for several weeks in a strange, sticky equilibrium. The siege did not slacken, but it produced no decisive turn either, as though the war itself, having lost its two greatest warriors on opposite sides of the front, had for a time lost its former momentum and was casting about for a new resolution. Troy, bled by the loss of Hector, nonetheless held on wounded, but unbroken, still able to repel assaults, still believing that endurance would in the end wear the enemy down more surely than stone walls ever could. It was precisely this stubborn Trojan patience that pushed Odysseus toward the decision that would go down in history as the greatest ruse of war in the ancient world. He had long understood one obvious truth. A frontal assault, however precisely planned, would cost the Greeks enormous losses and offered no guarantee of success against a city whose walls had proven stronger than any calculation. What was needed was a solution of an entirely different order, not one of force, but of psychology, striking not at stone, but at belief. The calculations underlying this plan Odysseus had received from his advisor long before the idea began to take physical shape. Jarvis had analyzed years of observation of Troy's religious traditions and identified one detail that remained invisible to an ordinary commander, but became an obvious vulnerability under sufficiently deep analysis of the So's enemy's cultural code. Reverence for the horse as a sacred animal under the patronage of the god of the sea was for the Trojans not merely tradition, but something bordering on superstitious awe. An enormous wooden structure in the shape of a horse, left at the city walls as a symbolic offering, would in all likelihood be received not as a ruse of war, but as a gesture of reconciliation or an offering to the god, and this very misconception could be turned into a weapon. The plan demanded jeweler's precision in its engineering. The structure had to hold enough fully armed warriors while remaining light enough for the Trojans to physically haul it through the city gates, and sealed enough on the outside to keep the men hidden within from giving themselves away with a stray sound or movement. The load calculations for the support beams, ventilation for several dozen men waiting in darkness for hours on end, the weight distribution needed to keep the structure from collapsing during transport. All of this engineering, unthinkable for the Bronze Age, had been worked out in advance, down to the last detail, before the Greek carpenters ever picked up an axe. Building the horse took several weeks, and throughout that time the Greek camp lived a double life, a flurry of visible activity in plain sight of Trojan observers, and an almost religious faith in a plan that, on the surface, looked like madness, but had been calibrated with a precision beyond the understanding of anyone not let in on it. Finally, on one particular night, the Greek fleet demonstratively weighed anchor and pulled away from shore, creating for the besieged city the illusion that the war was over, while on the empty beach stood the colossal wooden horse, and inside it, cramped and suffocating, lay hidden the coalition's finest warriors, waiting for their hour. Troy, waking at dawn to an empty beach in an abandoned camp, allowed itself for the first time in 10 years to believe the siege was over. The joy that swept the city was genuine and almost feverish. The standoff had dragged on too long. Too many generations of Trojans had gone without seeing a peaceful sky overhead, to let slip the chance to believe in salvation. It was this hunger for the war's end, not stupidity or gullibility, that drove the Trojans toward the decision that would destroy their city. The wooden horse left on the shore was hauled through the city gates as a trophy and a sign of divine favor. Despite the warnings of the few voices urging caution, voices lost amid the general rejoicing. Aeneas that day was among those watching the events unfold with a growing, inexplicable unease. Years of war had trained an instinct in him that refused to accept sudden, too convenient good fortune, and the sight of the enormous wooden structure being wheeled into the city, amid the jubilant cries of a war-weary populace, produced in him a feeling hard to put into words, but one worth taking seriously. He couldn't know for certain what was actually happening. He had neither Jarvis's calculations nor any knowledge of Odysseus's plan, but the instinct of a warrior who had lived 9 years of war unmistakably. Sensed the falseness in this too generous stroke of luck. That night, once the city, exhausted by celebration, finally sank into a heavy, drunken sleep, Aeneas did not allow himself to relax. The disc at his belt seemed heavier than usual, though its physical weight hadn't changed by a gram, as if the device itself sensed the approach of the moment it had been made for. Toward dawn, the Greek warriors, hidden inside the horse, silently climbed down, opened the city gates from within, and troops that had spent the entire time concealed near the shore, waiting for the signal, poured into a city that had spent the whole night feasting in the certainty that the war was over. What began after that would go down in history as one of the swiftest and most merciless endings of the ancient world. A city that had withstood a 10-year siege fell in a single night. The cries of alarm rising almost simultaneously from every corner of Troy found Aeneas already armed and ready, the same wariness that had kept him from relaxing even in the hour of universal rejoicing. He threw himself into the fighting alongside the few defenders who had gathered, trying to hold back for even a few precious hours the wave now sweeping the city. And in these desperate, scattered skirmishes on Troy's narrow streets, he witnessed what would remain for the rest of his life. The most terrible sight of everything he had endured during the years of the siege. But his duty as a warrior very soon collided with a duty of another order, one far more urgent. The glow of fires rapidly consuming quarter after quarter was closing in inexorably on the house where his father, wife, and young son waited, and at some point Aeneas understood, with absolute, sobering clarity, the city could no longer be saved. Only those four could still be saved, the ones for whose sake the plate had been left, the one that hadn't left his belt in months. He ran for home through burning streets, shoving through crowds of townspeople crazed with terror, past collapsing buildings, past scenes that defied description. The fire climbing over the rooftops, quarter by quarter, moved faster than seemed possible. And by the time Aeneas reached the threshold of his own house, flames were already licking the walls of neighboring buildings, and the crackle of burning cedar merged with the screams pouring in from every direction of a city that only yesterday had been at peace. At home, he was met by those for whose sake he had ever agreed to carry this device, which over the past months had become almost a part of his own body. His father, frail and weakened by age, unable to move fast enough on his own to escape through the burning city. His wife, frozen in the grip of terror at the sight of the glow devouring quarter after quarter. His small son, too young to fully grasp the scale of what was happening, but old enough to feel the mortal fear saturating the very air. There was no time left to think. Aeneas pulled the disc from beneath his cloak, that very object which for months had been a burden of doubt and impossible calculations, and began to act with the speed of a man for whom a single second of hesitation could cost every remaining life. And it was here, in the last desperate minutes before activation, that all the agonizing arithmetic that had piled up over months came crashing down on him at once, demanding an immediate, final decision. His gaze darted to the chest of family valuables, to where his grandfather's weapons lay. Jewelry passed down through the family for generations, scrolls bearing the genealogy the Trojan nobility had kept for centuries. His hand, for a moment, reached toward that chest, obeying an instinct older than any calculation, the instinct to preserve not merely life, but memory, legacy, proof that the line had existed and had been something that mattered. But that motion lasted only a fraction of a second. Aeneas snatched his hand back from the chest as sharply as if the gold inside it had suddenly turned white hot. He tore off his weapons, the sword he had carried for years, the shield he had inherited from his father, and threw them onto the floor of the house, there to remain forever, buried beneath the ashes of a city that would soon exist no more. He stripped from his neck and hands everything that might add even a handful of extra weight, leaving only simple clothing on the bodies of the four people for whom this final, mercilessly precise plate had been calibrated. He lifted his father onto his shoulders, the way he had carried him 1,000 times over the past months, ever since old age had finally robbed Anchises of the ability to move any real distance on his own. He pressed his son against himself with one arm, tightly, as though that single embrace alone could shield him from everything happening outside. He pushed his wife toward the center of the plate, where the disc's matte surface glowed faintly blue in the smoke-filled dimness of a house already wrapped in the glow of a fire climbing toward the roof. Greek voices, shouting commands somewhere very close outside, grew louder by the second, and through the cracks of the scorched door the first tongues of flame were already breaking through. Aeneas stepped onto the plate last, wrapping his arms around all three at once, his father on his shoulders, his son at his chest, his wife beside him, and in that final second, before the device activated, The entire weight of months of agonizing calculations collapsed into one short, desperate motion of his hand toward the single indicator on the surface of the disk. The indicator on the surface of the disk flared from its dim blue glow into blinding white light. And in that same instant, the air around the four figures on the plate contracted inward with a short, almost inaudible papa sound so insignificant against the roar of the burning city that any chance witness standing a couple of meters from the house would most likely have mistaken it for the crack of a collapsing beam. The flash lasted no longer than a single heartbeat. The light burst outward in a thin ring, bleaching the smoke-stained walls of the room down to the last crack in the plaster for an instant, and in the next instant died out as swiftly as it had appeared. The room stood empty. There was no father, no wife, no son, no Aeneas himself, left only a sword and shield abandoned on the floor, soon to be buried beneath the first flakes of ash falling from the collapsing ceiling. The flames, which a minute earlier had seemed like the central character of this scene, now devoured the empty house unopposed, with nothing left to defend and no one left to save. Within a matter of minutes, the house's door, charred and half torn from its hinges, finally gave way under the blows of Greek soldiers bursting inside. They rushed in weapons first, expecting to meet resistance or, at the very least, terrified residents in hiding this Trojan quarter that night had been sparing with neither. Instead, they found only an empty, fire-engulfed room, weapons abandoned on the floor, and an absolute, inexplicable silence, starkly at odds with the chaos of the city's fall raging all around. One of the soldiers, unable to explain what he'd seen, reported the anomaly to command. The way one reports any detail that doesn't fit the overall picture of a battle without particular significance, lost among 100 other reports of captured districts and burned houses. That report, however, reached more than just the ears of the Greek commanders. In the tent, already pitched on the outskirts of the burning city, where Odysseus had moved his command post as the first signs of the operation's success came in, the tablet at his belt let out a short, barely perceptible signal, a tone Odysseus had, over the preceding months, already learned to associate with something worthy of his personal attention. Jarvis's voice, unfailingly calm and courteous, even amid the roar of a falling city, reported an anomaly the instruments had registered a few minutes earlier, a brief burst of energy of unknown origin, its source located in one of the noble quarters of Troy. The nature of the burst didn't fit within any physical model known to Jarvis. Its signature, in structure, resembled quantum processes that shouldn't exist even in theory in this millennium, far more than anything producible by means available to either Troy or Ithaca. Hearing the report, Odysseus felt a faint, almost superstitious unease, not over the outcome of the battle, which was already decided, but over that vague, inexplicable feeling that visits even the most rational people from time to time. The sense that somewhere in this night, something had happened far more significant than the fall of one legendary city. He couldn't know what the burst actually meant. Jarvis, analyzing the residual data, could only determine an approximate set of coordinates the anomaly's energy appeared tied to, if the calculations were to be trusted, a region lying far to the west, on the opposite shore of the sea, in lands that for the Greeks of that time remained almost legend. Latium, on the Apennine Peninsula, future Italy. The artificial mind could offer nothing more. The energy source had faded as swiftly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but that single coordinate point and the data confirming that whatever the device's total energy potential had been, it had now been spent entirely, down to the last reserve, on this one single use. That same night, while Troy burned to its foundations and Greek triumph spread through streets that only yesterday had been peaceful and lived in, 4 people, who only minutes earlier had stood on the threshold of certain death, found themselves in an entirely different place, on the gentle, forested bank of a river, in the soft, undisturbed dusk of an Italian night, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the lapping of water, not the roar of collapsing walls and the death cries of a dying city. Aeneas, still clutching his son and still holding on to his father, whom he continued to support on his shoulders even in the first disoriented seconds after the transfer, didn't grasp what had happened right away. The silence that fell over him after hours of battle's roar felt almost physically tangible, as if the very nature of this new place refused to believe in the reality of the hell he had just torn himself out of. The disc in his hand, which only a moment before had glowed faintly blue, had now gone dark for good, its last indicator extinguished, never to relight. The device had fulfilled its one and only purpose, completely, with no possibility of repetition, and now it remained nothing but a lifeless, cooling piece of material, destined to lie buried in Italian soil for the next 3,000 years, waiting for the day a 21st century archaeological expedition would stumble across its base in a trench on the banks of the Tiber. Every promise Tony Stark had made that distant night by the Trojan well had been fulfilled to the letter, without a single discrepancy. The city had fallen exactly as history had decreed, not a day early, not a day late. Aeneas, his father, his wife, and his son had been saved, precisely those four whose weight had fit perfectly within the allotted limit, without a single extra gram of gold or family relic. And the land on which they now stood was exactly the land spoken of in that cryptic promise of an empire destined to rise from the ashes of a burned city. Odysseus, for his part, brought his own war to a victorious end with the full support of an artificial mind that never once failed him across the long months of fighting. His own story, however, was still far from over. A long, danger-filled journey home to Ithaca still awaited him. But that is an entirely different tale, one that falls outside the story told here. There's one detail worth noting, one that escaped both heroes' attention on the night of Troy's fall but deserves separate reflection. The technological superiority Odysseus possessed throughout the entire campaign proved to be a decisive factor. Militarily, it precisely calculated timing, tactics, the enemy's weak points. But it saved not a single human soul worth waging this entire war, for it only made destroying the city more efficient. The device that ended up in Aeneas's hands, meanwhile, was fundamentally different in nature. It gave no advantage in battle, helped no one win, served as no weapon. It served a single purpose, the preservation of those who cannot be replaced, and it was precisely this one function, and not military might, that determined an outcome which, across the span of millennia, would prove to weigh far more than the war itself. The story of Troy, retold countless times across the millennia, traditionally ends in ashes and captivity, the fall of a great city, the triumph of the victors, the wanderings of the defeated. But buried within this story, beneath the roar of battles and the cunning of strategies, there has always lain a far quieter and far more important lesson, one easily lost amid the vividness of the battle scenes. No technological superiority, no mind, however perfect, capable of calculating the outcome of a battle many moves in advance, saved Troy. The city walls, standing for 10 years, did not fall for lack of courage among their defenders, nor for any shortage of military cunning on their part. They fell to human pride, to the failure to recognize a trap within one's own triumph in time, to that fatal instant when celebration eclipsed caution. The greatest fortress of the ancient world proved defenseless, not against bronze and fire, but against its own desire to believe too good news. But where a kingdom collapsed, a family endured. Aeneas saved his loved ones, not through superior strength and not through cunning weaponry, but through his willingness to give up everything that was not absolutely necessary for the lives of those he loved. He carried his father on his own shoulders through the burning city, just as all the tradition that follows carries him, remembering this image as one of the most poignant symbols of filial duty in all of ancient culture. He left behind the gold, his ancestors' weapons, the evidence of his family's renown, everything that had seemed inseparable from the very idea of legacy, for the chance to preserve the one true legacy, lives that would carry this line forward, into a new age, on a new land. In this simple but complete choice between treasure and life, between the memory of objects and the memory of blood, lies a truth far older than the Trojan War itself. A truth that, long before Aeneas, and long before the composition of the Homeric epic, was set down in sacred texts far more cautious about wealth than is commonly believed. The book of Proverbs says that better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it, and that whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Proverbs 15:16 and 11:28. This ancient wisdom, spoken in another language in another age, remarkably mirrors the choice made in that burning Trojan house by one single man. A man unburdened by the weight of gold, but carrying a far heavier load, his own father on his shoulders, his own son against his chest. It was not weapons that saved Aeneas, not cunning, not strength, not the technological superiority that, in other hands, on that very same night, was as sweeping as it could be. What saved him was humility, the willingness to accept a limit that no ingenuity could get around, and, within that limit, to choose not what was precious, but what was truly priceless. And perhaps this is the true meaning of the ancient psalm, declaring that the Lord preserves all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. Psalm 144-20. Not a literal promise of protection from fire and sword, but a far deeper law of existence, one by which a man carrying not gold but love on his shoulders will always find his way out of